In a distant galaxy, far beyond the reaches of Earth, the alien queen's capture was not just an act of war. It was a challenge to everything that had ever been believed about humanity. She had been one of the most powerful beings in the universe, ruling her people with wisdom and strength. Yet now she was nothing more than a prisoner in the hands of a ruthless alien faction, her once invincible empire crumbling around her. Her capture had been swift and brutal, a display of the enemy's technological superiority. With her hands bound and her once proud posture now bent, the Queen was thrown into a dark, cold cell aboard a massive spaceship. The walls of the prison ship were metallic and unforgiving, the air thick with the smell of fear. Her mind raced with questions. How had it all come to this? How had she, the mighty Queen, fallen so easily? She had been taken by surprise, the plans she had so carefully laid for the defense of her people crushed in an instant. As she sat there, staring into the void of space beyond the small window of her cell, she realized that there was no one left to save her. She had been betrayed by her closest allies, left behind by those who had once pledged their loyalty. Alone, she could only wait for whatever fate awaited her at the hands of her captors. And yet, deep down, there was a spark of hope. A small part of her that refused to accept defeat. But what she didn't know was that fate had something entirely different in store for her. A rescue was coming, but not from the hands of another alien warrior or a fleet of her loyal soldiers. No, it would come from the most unlikely of sources: humanity. Jake was just an ordinary soldier, part of a small human resistance group fighting against the alien invaders. He had never considered himself a hero, nor did he believe he could ever achieve anything extraordinary. He was not a trained warrior, not someone who had ever dreamed of saving a galaxy. But the day his life would change forever had arrived. It all started with a mission. Jake's resistance group had received a tip, an encrypted message that spoke of a high-value prisoner being held aboard a massive enemy ship. The message was vague, but it was clear enough to confirm that the prisoner was none other than the alien queen. The mission seemed impossible. How could they possibly infiltrate a heavily guarded ship, free a prisoner of such importance, and make it out alive? The group was small, outmatched, and outgunned. And yet, despite the odds, something inside Jake stirred. He felt a sense of responsibility, something that he had never felt before. He knew he couldn't just sit back and let the Queen's fate unfold without attempting to change it. Jake's heart raced as he suited up for the mission. His hands trembled slightly, but his resolve was clear. This was no ordinary mission. It was the most dangerous thing he had ever been asked to do. It wasn't just about saving a prisoner. It was about sending a message. If a human could save the alien queen, perhaps they could prove that humanity had more to offer than their enemies ever realized. Perhaps they could show the galaxy that even the smallest of beings could make a difference. The plan was simple, or at least it seemed simple. Jake, along with a small team of soldiers, would board the enemy ship under the cover of darkness, sneak through its corridors, and locate the Queen. Once they found her, they would need to get her out and escape without being detected. But as they made their way through the dark, narrow hallways of the spaceship, Jake quickly realized that nothing was going to go as planned. The ship was a maze of high-tech security systems, alien guards, and dangerous obstacles. Every corner they turned seemed to present a new threat. Jake's pulse quickened as they made their way deeper into the ship. He could feel the weight of the mission pressing on him. There was no room for error. If they were caught, the Queen's eye, life would be lost forever. And so would theirs. As they moved silently through the halls, Jake's mind raced. He had always been a man of simple desires. He never sought glory or recognition. But now, with each step they took toward the Queen, he felt the heavy responsibility of what he was about to do. He wasn't just walking into enemy territory to rescue someone. He was walking into the heart of an empire, defying all odds to save a ruler who, under normal circumstances, would have seen humans as nothing more than inferior beings. Jake had never met the Queen, but he had heard the stories. They said she was ruthless, powerful, and above all unyielding. It was said that no one could stand against her, no one except for another alien race. But Jake didn't care about the Queen's reputation. He cared about doing what was right. And right now, rescuing her was the only thing that mattered. They reached the Queen's cell, and for the first time, Jake could see her through the thick glass. Her eyes met his for a moment, filled with both confusion and hope. The Queen had never imagined that a human would be the one to come for her. But here he was, the unlikely hero, ready to defy the impossible. The ship trembled as alarms suddenly blared, shattering the silence. The guards had been alerted. It was now or never. Jake turned to his team, signaling them to move quickly. This was the moment. This was when the story would begin. Jake's heart raced as the alarms echoed through the dark corridors of the enemy ship. The sound was deafening, a warning that the mission had been compromised. His mind raced faster than his feet could carry. Him, calculating their options. They had only minutes, maybe seconds, to get the alien Queen out of her cell and escape before the full force of the ship's security system zeroed in on them. His team moved quickly but silently, their footsteps barely making a sound on the cold metal floor. Jake's eyes never left the Queen's cell, a prison of unyielding glass and steel. He couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment pressing on him. This wasn't just a rescue mission anymore. It was the turning point of a war, a statement that humans weren't to be underestimated. He had never felt so alive, so driven, but also so terrified. They were surrounded by enemies who had far more power, weapons, and experience. And yet, it was up to him, an ordinary man, to pull off the impossible. As he approached the Queen's cell, Jake's pulse thundered in his ears. He took a deep breath and glanced back at his team. 2 of them were by his side, each one equally tense, their eyes wide with fear. They had trained for this moment, but there was no preparing for what was about to happen. "Stay focused," Jake whispered to his team. "We get her out, we get back, simple as that." He wasn't sure if his words were meant to reassure them or himself. He didn't feel reassured. The closer they got to the Queen's cell, the more oppressive the silence became. The weight of the alarms was a constant reminder that they were running out of time. The ship's security forces were no doubt scrambling to find the source of the breach. "Ready?" Jake asked as he turned to face the Queen's cell. The others nodded, their hands on their weapons, their fingers gripping the triggers with the slightest twitch. The Queen stood motionless inside the glass, her eyes locked on Jake as if she could sense his every thought. Her gaze was intense, not with fear, but with something more complex. Was it hope? Or was it just the desperation of someone who had lost everything? Jake didn't have time to ponder her feelings. With a swift motion, he activated the override panel next to the cell, hacking into the ship's control systems. Sweat beaded on his forehead as his fingers danced across the interface. The alarms blared louder, signaling that their time was running out. He could hear the sound of footsteps, heavy boots coming in their direction. "Come on," Jake muttered under his breath. His heart beat faster, his hands shaking from the pressure. He couldn't fail now. Finally, the lock on the Queen's cell released with a loud click, the glass door hissing open just enough for Jake to slip inside. He motioned for the Queen to follow, but she hesitated, her sharp eyes scanning the corridor beyond. "Do you trust me?" Jake asked urgently. His voice was low, almost pleading. For a moment, the Queen didn't answer. She looked at him, as if considering the risk. Her expression softened, and then without a word, she stepped toward him, her feet barely making a sound. She was more graceful than Jake had imagined, her movements fluid and precise despite her captivity. Jake led her out of the cell and into the corridor, but before they could take more than a few steps, a loud crash echoed from the hallway. Ahead, the sound of heavy boots grew louder, and suddenly, a group of armed soldiers appeared at the far end of the corridor. Jake's breath caught in his throat. There was no time to retreat, no time to think. The enemy soldiers were fast approaching, and they had nowhere to hide. The Queen's gaze flickered to Jake, her eyes narrowing with determination. She stepped forward, standing tall despite the odds. "We fight," she said simply, her voice calm but filled with the unmistakable tone of a leader. Jake hesitated for only a second, then nodded. He wasn't sure how, but they had to survive. He turned to his team, signaling them to take positions. Weapons raised, they readied themselves for the oncoming storm. The first enemy soldier rounded the corner, but Jake was ready. He fired a quick shot to the soldier's chest, sending him crashing to the floor. The others reacted instantly, returning fire. The sound of gunfire erupted through the hallway, sharp and echoing. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he moved quickly, dodging blasts and taking cover behind the ship's metal walls. The Queen, standing with an eerie calm, raised her hand, and suddenly, a burst of energy shot from her palm, sending the nearest soldier flying back against the wall. The power she unleashed was like nothing Jake had ever seen, so raw, so intense that it left him speechless. She wasn't just a prisoner, she was a force to be reckoned with. But even with the Queen's power, the odds were still stacked against them. More soldiers poured into the corridor, their weapons aimed at the two humans and their alien ally. Jake's team fought valiantly, but they were outnumbered. The enemy's fire was relentless, and the walls seemed to close in around them. "Retreat!" Jake shouted to his team. "We can't win this fight. Get to the escape pods." But just as they turned to run, an explosion ripped through the corridor, shaking the entire ship. The lights flickered, and the ground trembled beneath their feet. Jake barely kept his balance as the ship seemed to shift violently in space. They had no choice but to push forward, deeper into the ship's labyrinthine hallways. The Queen's power crackled through the air as she led the way, her focus unwavering. With every step, Jake could feel the weight of the mission growing heavier. There was no turning back now. The real danger had just begun. The ship shook violently, its metal hull groaning under the pressure of the battle that raged inside. Jake could feel the vibrations in his chest as the blast from the explosion echoed down the corridor. The flashing red emergency lights illuminated the path ahead, casting an eerie glow over the cold, unfeeling walls. There was no time to stop, no time to think. They had to keep moving. The Queen, her glowing eyes steady, led the way through the maze of corridors, her every step precise and calculated. Jake followed closely behind, trying to keep his team together in the chaos. His heart raced, not just from the battle, but from the growing realization that they were on the edge of something far greater than a mere rescue mission. This was a war. As they rounded another corner, they came face to face with another squad of enemy soldiers. The sight of their heavily armored suits and powerful weapons stopped Jake in his tracks. They were trapped. The soldiers raised their guns, their faces cold and determined. Jake's breath caught in his throat. This was it. There was no way out of this one. But then, the Queen did something that Jake hadn't expected. She stepped forward, raising her hand, her fingers twitching ever so slightly. A low hum filled the air, and suddenly a pulse of energy shot from her palm, knocking the soldiers back against the walls. The force of the blast was so powerful that the entire hallway trembled, the walls cracking with the sheer power of her energy. Jake stood frozen, watching in awe as the Queen effortlessly took down the enemy soldiers with nothing but a flick of her hand. He had seen the reports, heard the rumors, but to witness it firsthand was something entirely different. She was more than just a prisoner. She was a force of nature. The remaining soldiers scrambled to regain their footing, but the Queen wasn't finished. With a fluid motion, she moved forward, her every step deliberate. She didn't need to speak. Her body language said it all. The fight wasn't over yet. Jake snapped out of his daze, taking cover behind a nearby pillar as gunfire rang out from the remaining soldiers. His team fired back, their shots barely missing their enemies as they tried to hold their ground. Jake, his own weapon at the ready, found his focus returning. This was his mission now, this was his fight, and with the Queen's power at their side, they just might stand a chance. The soldiers, realizing they were up against something far beyond their expectations, began to fall back, retreating down the corridor. But the Queen wasn't going to let them escape so easily. With another surge of energy, she knocked several of them off their feet, sending them crashing into the walls, their bodies crumpling like ragdolls. But as the Queen's energy surged through the ship, so did the enemy's. Counterattack. More soldiers appeared from the shadows, surrounding them on all sides. They were outnumbered, and Jake could see the fear creeping into the eyes of his team. The Queen was powerful, yes, but she wasn't invincible. They still had to find a way off the ship alive. Fall back, Jake shouted to his team, his voice cutting through the chaos. We need to get to the escape pods now. But the Queen held her ground. Her eyes, fierce and determined, never wavered as she faced down the incoming enemy soldiers. Jake could feel her unwavering resolve. She wouldn't back down. Not after everything she had endured. This was her fight too. And yet, as the enemy forces closed in, Jake could see that the situation was growing more desperate by the second. The hallway was narrowing, the pressure mounting. The escape pods, their only chance for survival, felt miles away. Jake's mind raced. He had to make a decision. Could they fight their way out of this? Could they really survive against so many enemies? In the midst of the chaos, he turned to the Queen. We need to move. We can't stay here, he said urgently. The Queen's gaze softened for a moment, her power crackling through the air. She understood. She nodded once, then gestured for Jake to lead the way. Without another word, Jake dashed forward, his team following closely behind. The Queen, her eyes scanning the surroundings, protected their backs, fending off enemy soldiers with precise blasts of energy. Each time they advanced, the enemies fell back, but more were always waiting in the shadows. They couldn't keep up this pace forever. The group rounded another corner, their hearts pounding in their chests as they encountered yet another wave of enemies. This time, Jake didn't hesitate. He opened fire, taking down two of the soldiers with quick, precise shots. The rest of his team followed suit, the sound of gunfire blending with the Queen's energy blasts as the corridor was filled with chaos. But even with all the firepower, the enemies just kept coming. Their numbers were overwhelming, and Jake could see that they were running low on ammunition. Suddenly, a bright light flashed in front of them, blinding Jake for a split second. When his vision cleared, he saw the Queen standing in the center of the hallway, her hands raised high. A massive wave of energy exploded outward, pushing the enemy soldiers back like a powerful tidal wave. The force of the blast left Jake breathless, his body shaking from the raw power of the Queen's attack. In that moment, he realized something he hadn't before. The Queen wasn't just a prisoner, she was the key to their survival. She was their hope, their only chance of escaping this nightmare. But there was still one more obstacle to overcome: getting to the escape pods. The final battle for survival had only just begun, and the stakes were higher than ever. The chaos around them was deafening, the blaring alarms and the sound of gunfire mixing with the pounding of their hearts. Jake's chest heaved as he sprinted down the hallway, the Queen close behind him, her energy-filled gaze never leaving the enemies who were still in pursuit. The ship was now a maze of destruction, each hallway, each room filled with the wreckage of their failed attempts to escape. But they couldn't stop now. Not when they were so close to freedom. The escape pods were just ahead. One last hallway, one last door between them and safety. But as they reached the end of the corridor, a new wave of enemies appeared, blocking their only exit. Jake's pulse raced as he instinctively raised his weapon, his hands trembling. There was no way they were getting through without a fight. And yet the odds were stacked against them. The soldiers were too many, too well armed, and Jake knew they couldn't hold out much longer. The Queen stood beside him, her eyes steely with resolve. She had already given so much, her power, her energy, yet she wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. She stepped forward, her hands raised to harness the full force of her abilities. The air around them crackled with energy, her power surging. As she prepared for one final stand, Jake glanced at his team. They were exhausted, their weapons nearly spent, their bodies battered from the fierce fighting. But they were still here. They were still alive. And that meant they had a chance. "I won't let you down," Jake muttered under his breath, more to himself than to anyone else. He wasn't about to die here, not after everything they'd been through. The first soldier fired, and the entire hallway lit up with gunfire. Jake ducked behind the corner, narrowly avoiding the incoming blasts. His heart was pounding, his thoughts racing. He knew that without the Queen's powers, they would never make it. She was their only hope. The Queen, however, didn't hesitate. With a single motion, she sent out a wave of pure energy, knocking the soldiers off their feet and sending them sprawling against the walls. Their weapons dropped to the floor, useless in the face of her overwhelming strength. But there were still more soldiers, more coming from the other side of the hallway. "We need to get out of here now," Jake shouted, his voice hoarse with desperation. The Queen, still calm in the face of the danger, nodded. She didn't need to say anything. The look in her eyes said it all. They could still make it if they acted quickly. But as they rushed toward the escape pods, an explosion suddenly shook the ship. The floor beneath their feet cracked and the walls buckled. The entire ship trembled as if it were coming apart. Jake lost his balance, falling to one knee as the shockwave passed through the ship. He looked up just in time to see the Queen stumble, her energy flickering. "Stay with me," Jake shouted, his voice frantic. "We're almost there." The Queen, weakened by the constant use of her power, nodded once, her face set with determination. But even she couldn't fight the inevitable. Her strength was waning, and the force of the explosion had left her disoriented. They made it to the escape pods, but the door to the nearest one was sealed shut, the ship's system refusing to let them through. "Come on." Jake slammed his fist against the door. "Open! Open, damn it!" The Queen staggered forward, her energy crackling faintly. With a strained breath, she raised her hand, sending a pulse of power toward the door. It creaked, groaned, and then, finally, flung open with a hiss of air. "Let's go," Jake shouted. He pushed the Queen inside, and the rest of the team followed. As they settled into the pod, the doors sealed shut behind them, and the small craft launched into space, escaping the crumbling ship. The crew's hearts pounded in their chests as they looked out the small windows, watching the massive enemy ship fall apart behind them, flames and debris scattering across the void. The Queen leaned back against the seat, breathing heavily. Jake turned to her, his eyes full of gratitude and awe. He had saved her, and in doing so he had saved them all. You did it," Jake said, his voice filled with wonder. The Queen's lips curved into a tired but sincere smile. "We did it," she corrected, her voice weak but resolute. "You humans showed me what courage truly means." Jake didn't know how to respond to that. He had never considered himself a hero. He had only done what he felt was right. But, hearing her words, seeing the Queen, who was once a symbol of power and might, acknowledge his actions, made everything worth it. As the escape pod drifted into the unknown, away from the battle and into the vastness of space, there was a moment of silence, a brief, fragile moment where everything seemed to stop. They had survived. They had won. The Queen, now in the safety of the pod, turned to Jake. "You've proven that humans are more than just survivors. You're fighters. You're heroes." Jake looked at her, his heart swelling with pride. "We fight for each other," he said quietly. "No one is ever truly alone. Not as long as we stand together." The stars stretched out before them, endless and beautiful. For the first time in a long while, Jake allowed himself to relax. He knew they had only just begun to change the course of history. And as the Queen sat beside him, both of them staring into the vast expanse of space, they knew that this victory, this improbable, impossible victory, was just the beginning of a new chapter. A chapter where humanity's strength was no longer underestimated, where they were no longer seen as weak. In that moment, Jake realized something powerful. The greatest victories often come from the most unlikely places. And sometimes, all it takes is one person, one hero, to change the future.